Well, welcome to another episode of Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and I'll be with you here discussing the post-election problem that we now have to deal with. And I'm not going to talk about the candidates, and that has been talked about so often that we're all sick of that. We don't want to actually hear those names of the candidates. I'm going to try not to mention the candidates by name, because we've all heard of them so much. We're oversaturated with the elections. But the 2016 national United States elections are over. We know who won, we know who lost. But what I want to talk about today is the media influence in shaping reality. And we've learned a great deal about the media and the power of the media from the experience of the 2016 election in the United States. We knew that the television, radio, print, internet, news media was influential. We knew that already. But now what we have confirmation of is that the power of the electronic media to actually influence the outcome of elections and to shift the perception of reality to such an extent that it probably cost Clinton the election, but it just as well might have discouraged Trump voters from voting as well. So it's hard to tell who actually benefited from it, but there was a definite, clear reality that was presented by the news media that Clinton would overwhelmingly win. The perception was that it was going to be Clinton who won, and everyone in the news media, CNN, ABC, MSNBC, CBS, even Fox News, even the Independent, it looked like Clinton would win. The only problem, the only issue was how much would she win. And that was the news media perception. And that was built into such an extent that it was almost a reality going in. But then as the night unfolded, election night unfolded, these news media outlets were shocked that their presentation of reality wasn't turning out the way they had presented it. And they were shocked that the message they were giving, the message they were promoting and telling people, that was not presenting itself out in reality. And in reality, the news media got it totally, completely wrong. And that makes us step back as Christians, because we want to analyze this from a Christian worldview, biblical worldview perspective. We want to say, wait a minute. If the media got the perception of reality wrong on this point, and it was verified wrong by the count of the votes on election night, what other things are they getting wrong that aren't verifiable? What other things are they presenting to us that are totally false, although we can't verify it's false because we don't have a tally mechanism to show that it's false? Probably quite a lot of things are gotten wrong by the news media, but we don't know that they're wrong. And so if we trust the news media, if we trust CNN, if we trust MSNBC, if we trust ABC, CBS, Fox News, etc., if we trust them to give us an objective reality picture, we will be deluded because they are wrong on a number of different things. And it's scary to know how wrong they are. Well, I was thinking back as I saw what happened on election night. The media got it all wrong. They were totally off, 180-degree wrong. As I was thinking about that, I was thinking back to a book that I had read many decades ago by the Christian theologian, the late Christian philosopher Francis Schaeffer, called The Christian Manifesto. And in one of the sections of that book, he says that, let me quote him on page 60 of the Christian Manifesto. He says, "The media, and especially television, have indeed changed the perception of not only current events, but also the political process. We must realize that things can easily be presented on television so that the perception of a thing may be quite different from the fact itself. Television not only reports political happenings, it enters actively into the political process. That is, either because of bias or for a good story, television so reports the political process that it influences and becomes a critical part of the political process itself. A good example was Walter Cronkite's part in orchestrating the Gerald Ford candidacy for vice president at the 1980 Republican Convention. So let me stop and note that on that point, he's talking about something that happened in 1980 at the Republican National Convention, whereby the news reporting of who the president would pick as a vice president actually influenced the president's selection of the vice presidency. So you have a case there in 1980 of Walter Cronkite actually influencing the political process by the way in which he reported. Francis Schaeffer goes on, we must realize that the communications media function much like an unelected federal bureaucracy. They are so powerful that they act as if they were a fourth branch of government in the United States. Charles Peters, editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly, in his book, How Washington Really Works, writes that the media, instead of exposing the make-believe of federal government, are part of the show. Television and the communications media in general, thus, are not only reporting news, but making it. Their ability to change our perception of any given event raises serious questions concerning the democratic process. So, and this is in 1980. This is before the rise of the internet. So we have another whole segment of electronic media that is influencing people today, especially the young people on their mobile devices, smartphones, etc., where they get most of their news, Facebook news feeds, and that kind of thing. So you have the reality today that the electronic news media is so big that it can influence our perception of reality. Now, we saw this happen during the 2016 election, where the news media basically had said that Clinton had won before she even had the election votes counted. Going into Election Day, Clinton was on top of all the polls, and the news media had basically called the election for Clinton. But as the night progressed, when it became apparent that Trump was actually going to win, the news media were totally shocked and totally frustrated and totally flabbergasted at the fact that they had been so wrong. But it wasn't just that the news media was so wrong. It was everyone who they were telling that this was going to be the case was so wrong. I mean, and think of the implications, though, for people still voting. Think of the implications of if you really thought that Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in to win the presidential election. If you were a Clinton supporter, you may not have gone to the polls because the media was telling you that it was a shoo-in. Clinton had already won. The polls were all indicating that. So you might not have voted for her. And as it turned out, she actually lost the election. So what was the result of millions and millions of people not voting for Hillary Clinton because they thought, because the media was telling that she was already going to win, it could have possibly cost Clinton the election. On the other hand, if you were a Trump supporter and you were being told constantly from the news media that Clinton was going to win, it was just a matter of how big she was going to win, you might have been discouraged enough to not even bother voting if there were some other conflicting schedules, events in your life that you couldn't get to the polls. You would say, oh, well, Clinton already won anyway, so why should I vote? And you might not have gone to the polls. And it would have been a bigger turnout and a bigger victory for Trump if the news media had not been telling everyone that Clinton was going to win. So we don't know what the actual confirmable results would have been if the news media had not skewed perception of reality so bad and had gotten this news reporting so wrong. But what is interesting even more is that after the election, we see the power of the media again on display in broadcasting and reporting little demonstrations of disappointed people that Clinton did not win. It started in some little areas where some students, and maybe even high school students, people who didn't even reach voting age, were out and shouting and protesting, a handful of people. And guess who were there on the spot to put this all on camera and video and broadcast it around to the world? The media was there. CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS were all out at these little demonstrations, and they broadcast these little teeny demonstrations all over the world. And by doing so, by basically reporting on a non-event, they made it into a national and global event. And that's the power of the electronic media nowadays. And you could see it happen right after the election. Of course, there will be people who are disappointed in the results. In 2008, when the current president was first elected, there were many millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people who were disappointed in the results of that election. And yet, their numbers of disappointed people were out shouting and marching or whatever was not on television. Why? Because it's really not an event. If a few people, a few dozen people are upset about the results of an election, there's no need to train the television cameras on these people and make it some kind of a national event. But what we saw happen was that a few handful of people with the television reporters there and the cameras trained on them in a key area, for example, in New York City. It's very easy if it's in New York City for cameramen to go rush down there a block down the street and broadcast something that's really a non-event and make it into an event by broadcasting it. If NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News had not recovered these non-event protests, they wouldn't have become events. But because the news reporters were there covering these events, they became events. And that's the power of the news media to shape reality. Unfortunately, they can shape and twist and distort reality as well. We saw that happen before the elections when they were broadcasting what they thought was a fact, that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And that was a total distortion of reality. Again, after the election, when these protesters, a handful of protesters, all of a sudden, the news media make that protest an event, and then they encourage it by covering it nonstop and talking about it and playing it up. And all of a sudden, then you have events like that happening in other cities, and then they rush out there with the cameras to cover those non-events, and all of a sudden you have a big event that was fueled and basically created by the news media itself. That's how powerful we have the news media today, and we need to be aware of it. We need to be aware that the news is not simply reporting the news, it's actually creating the news. And that's what Francis Schaeffer was warning us. He was saying that we have to be careful, that we don't buy into or believe what we are being told on television, that we do not look at something on television and get the wrong impression of it. And get the wrong... This is what has happened time and time again that we've seen over the last, I think it's 2 or 3 years, where you have little movements spring up. And the reason they become movements is because the news people with their cameras are there live to cover some little event. And they can make that little event a major event. And then if it's a major event, then everyone starts talking about it. And then all of a sudden it gets all kinds of attention. Whereas before, if there were a few handful of people protesting something somewhere, it would have maybe been noted in a footnote or a back page story, but it wouldn't have become anything major. But today, there with the electronic media, with the live streaming, with the 24/7 cable and internet streaming, and now even people can do this themselves. They don't even have to be a media outlet company. They can do this themselves with Facebook Live. You can actually take your mobile device, your smartphone, and shoot video, live video, to your Facebook page live, and people all around the world can watch an event happen. Well, even with that, you're not going to get people tuning in and watching except maybe your friends who go to your Facebook page. But now with CNN, MSNBC, all of the internet networks live streaming around the world, you can turn a non-event into an event. And that's what we've seen happen over the last few days. And it's very dangerous. It's very deceiving, because we are challenged to think in terms of asking key questions. Is this really, this event that is being talked about and is being made into something big, is this really significant? Or is this something just a part of an agenda? We definitely know that most of the people in the news media, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, MSNBC, and so forth, we know that they were heavily, 99% pro Hillary Clinton for the election. We know that. And we could see that when she began to lose on election night. You could see the faces, the attitudes, the kind of disappointment in the newscaster's face and the way they talked. You could tell that they were disappointed because they wanted Hillary Clinton to win. And that's part of the reason why they were telling everyone that she would win, because part of that is actual reporting and part of that is actually wishing something to be the way they want it to be. And so that explains part of the distortion that they had. The other part of the distortion is that they, again, were part of the whole process of getting Hillary Clinton elected. And that's what, in fact, made people want to vote for Donald Trump, because he would say CNN is called the Clinton News Network, and he would make fun of the obvious bias of the media. Well, who can doubt that that is true? There is an obvious bias in the news media. And we saw that on election night, but then we saw something that resulted from the disappointment by the media people of the results of the election. They decided that they wanted to do something to counter that result. They wanted to enter into the political process and try to put pressure on the powers that be to somehow change the results of the election. And one of the things they could do, they felt, was to cover protest marches. And so what they did was they took the natural and normal disappointment of people who had voted for Hillary Clinton, who were disappointed that she lost, and they went around and they searched for some kind of emotional protest reaction. And sure enough, they found one somewhere, and then they began to live stream that protest and those feelings and those opinions of the people who were disappointed, and produce that as a news segment. And lo and behold, that began to grow because other people who were disappointed began to feed on that. And then they began to hold their own protests. And then when they held their protests, the cameras would go to their protest and live stream that, and so on and so forth. And then you had a snowball effect. So So the news media were not, again, simply covering things that were newsworthy events. I mean, a little protest somewhere of Hillary Clinton's loss is not a newsworthy event. But the news media made it a event that they then called newsworthy and called it newsworthy, and so it became a news item, whether it deserved to be or not. And so again, they're making news, not just reporting it. Let me read the words of Francis Schaeffer again, who explained all of this. The media, and especially television, have indeed changed the perception of not only current events, but also of the political process. We must realize that things can easily be presented on television so that the perception of a thing may be quite different from the fact itself. Television not only reports political happenings, it enters actively into the political process. That is, either because of bias or for a good story, television so reports the political process that it influences and becomes a crucial part of the political process itself. So, as Christians, we need to be aware of this influence that the media has on our perceptions of reality. Now, unfortunately, we have a whole generation, the current generation, the young people today, who have not thought through the implications of a biased media and misperception and distortion of reality. They have not thought that through. And so when they go to their Facebook page and they get news fed to them directly to their Facebook page, and they get all of their news from these news feeds to Facebook, they're not thinking in terms of, oh, this is biased, this is distorted, this is shaping my reality. They're just simply reading it and digesting that news, and that becomes for them the perception of reality. And that explains part of the reason why the younger generation was so disappointed with the Hillary Clinton loss, because they were so fed and led to believe that Hillary Clinton would win that that's all they heard, and that's all that they were thinking, is that, okay, we understand what's going to happen, and it didn't happen. And so they were so frustrated that they didn't know how to deal with it, and they still don't know how to deal with it. I mean, it's ridiculous. We have people today, younger people, writing such things as, well, maybe we can get the electors who are going to Philadelphia in December, maybe we can get them to change their elector votes from Trump to Clinton, or just to not vote for Trump. Maybe we can manipulate the electors. I mean, this has never been done before, and it shouldn't even be talked about. I mean, the results of the election are in. The democratic process was done, and there shouldn't be any talk about now trying to block the election of Donald Trump to presidency. I mean, you could do that with any disappointing election result, to try to manipulate and try to intimidate people into not carrying out their democratic duties. These electors have said that they would faithfully represent their state depending on what the election results were. And so now they have to go to Philadelphia in December and be faithful to what they said they would do. And for the younger generation to say, well, we can stop the process, we can block it, that is just being a sore loser. But they're sore because they were so misled, because they were believing all of their news feeds on the internet, smartphones, and their mobile devices when they go to Facebook and so forth, and they were disappointed. Well, if you think about it, it's not just young people that are being fed false information. It's all of us. When you go, for example, if you have Yahoo as your startup page, there's a news feed in there. You are not just fed neutral news items. Those news feed items are fed to you. And it's amazing how often I will get news feeds from news sources that are so propagandistically biased that you don't want to even have to read through those. I mean, I get news feeds from the Huffington Post. I get news feeds from Think Progress, MoveOn.org. All of these far left, liberal, radical left groups are put in the news feed as if they're somehow neutral news articles. These are not news articles. These are propaganda pieces, and yet they're put right in, mixed in with the other news sources like NBC, CBS, ABC. And these sources don't even pretend to be neutral. And yet they're thrown in the whole news mix as if they are just legitimate journalism. Well, they're propaganda arms. And the young people don't always realize that. They don't realize that what they're being fed by the internet search engines and internet companies are far from neutral news. And so this is just a big problem. This is a growing problem. It only underscores the need that as Christians, as Bible-believing Christians, we need to be very discerning. We need to get hold of some news outlets that we can trust. We need to create new news institutions where we can have somewhat of a sane view of what is actually happening and not rely so much on the secular news media. Because if we have to rely on them, we will be deceived. We will be tossed about just like many of the people are tossed about and have reality distorted to them by simply trusting CNN or NBC or ABC or CBS and so forth. We need to have more Christian news outlets. We need to have more Christian news media at our disposal so we can sift and sort, at least that we can get news articles from a Christian perspective that raise the right questions, that are not so obviously distorted from the far left, radical left. And we need to be able to say, well, who can be totally neutral, but at least this reporter is coming from a biblical Christian worldview. Our values are being respected, and we are getting fed the straight story, not just created from whole cloth by the biased reporters. And this is a warning for all of us. Be discerning, be critical. Don't trust everything you read or hear or listen to or watch on the internet or television or radio, because most of the time it's going to be distorted heavily. Well, I hope that's helped you in thinking about a Christian worldview, and we'll see you back next week on another episode of Christian Answers. God bless.